Welcome back everybody, and hot on the heels of the previous video where we tried using nature as a bit of incentive to do something different, which was the Spider-Man Rockagama, we have some bright coloured beetles and we have some Tyranids. Obviously Tyranids are perceived to be bugs, and so seemed like a good enough idea to perhaps try and emulate some coloration of nature bugs. And in this instance I thought, okay, let's try and get some iridescent kind of carapace looking colors going on, and chose some of the pearlescent FW paints. Tried a galactic blue, a Genesis green and an intermediate emerald green, and just placed those onto the scales on the back. Started with the blue and then washed over with the yellow ink, and when that was dry we put a bit of the Genesis green in between to try and get that blue green yellow progression that you can see on the shell of the beetle. And we put a few little black spots underneath that, and it looked a little bit too garish, and using a little bit of silver moss mixed with burnt umber, put a bit of a wash, a very liberal wash of this sort of brownish metallic coloration over the top to try and preserve some of that iridescence, but to tone it down a little so it's not as stark and poster color. And it sort of helped in some respects to sort of tone down just how bright that was. Choice then for the rest of the skin was to come in with a flame orange to emulate the bug, and place that on most of the body, but the initial image showed a sort of transition across the body parts or the legs, going from a dark to a light. And so in this instance here, mixing it up a little using black ink, but using Games Workshop's in yellow contrast paint, mixing those approximately 50-50 and applying them to the base of the legs to try and get sort of a grey brown type sort of coloration, and then coming back in with the flame orange to sort of blend that in so there is a sort of a transition from one colour to the next. And looking upon it, you just have that gut feel that it just looks ridiculous, and clearly, yeah, it wasn't floating my boat. And so I thought, okay, well look, oranges and reds work relatively well, so jump in with the blood red contrast paint, in this case the speed paint from Army Painter, just placing that over the plates to try and change the color somewhat and bring it into a sort of a similar color frame. And that seemed to improve the situation slightly. And then used a little bit of crimson just to highlight the weapon. Now I just did paint the weapon exactly the same as the rest of the creature, rather than having a total variation contrast, and that's probably not such a great idea because it just blends in and it is very difficult to perceive that he's actually holding a weapon. Just a few little details like on the eyes just for white, and also the teeth. Tongue was just a sort of a magenta color just to add a bit of sort of variety. And ultimately, yeah, not a fan, a bit meh as the title suggests, but this was an experiment, and we tried valiantly, but I think it was a relative failure. Put a little bit of Agrax Earthshade onto the hooves and things. It does make it a little bit shiny when it's dried, but just wanted to sort of differentiate them from the rest of the legs, and then finally go in with a bit of a dry brush to sort of emphasize some of the texture and edging on the model. And it looks at the end of the day, not fantastic, but hey, I just wanted to try some things, and obviously we didn't stop there. This is just the beginning of the experimentation, so we had a few more that we wanted to play with. I had some colors in my head and I thought, okay, we've tried using the pearlescent paint, let's actually just use the silver moss to try and get that carapace look again, but let's change the color up completely. Rather than trying to get too creative and match something, let's just go for a nice contrasting color scheme, because that seems to be the way most of them are done. So just placing the silver moss over the plate structure, and it does have a sort of a nice sheen. And then getting creative, using some more inks, this time mixing blue marine with black, but not putting it on as a straight ink, instead mixing it 50-50 with speed paint medium to make our own speed paint. The idea obviously being that it will pull away from the edges and hopefully give us a bit of an edge highlight without us having to do too much work and go in and do that after the fact. And it actually does a reasonably good job. The color wasn't too bad. You got some nice pooling, and we got some of the sort of dark coloration in the plates. So yeah, in terms of doing some magic for us, it certainly worked there. The rest of the creature just painting with black speed paint, and it had a bit of a zenithal highlight, so you can see the white speckling, and some of that does come through because the speed paint does have a little bit of translucency to it. And just slather that on, doing it segment by segment across the body to darken it all down. And I have found that black speed paint does work relatively well over a zenithal highlight to give you sort of a greyish texture. And you still have to go in and do some highlights clearly, but it seems to have a relatively good even base, so I'm pretty happy with that. Then going in with a galactic purple just to highlight the body joints and sort of sections where you can see whatever internal structure is visible there, just as a bit of a contrast, but it's a very muted contrast, so it's not too stark. It's nice and dark tone. You do see it, but you have to sort of look for it, and that sort of livened it up slightly. And the usual embellishment thereafter of going in and trying valiantly and miserably failing, doing the eyes and various other bits, and then not having enough black paint on the brush to put a little eye dot on the weapon eye, and hating the look of it and deciding, bugger that, I'm just going to put crimson red over the eyes. And at least they stood out a little bit better, so that worked well in that respect. This is more your sort of traditional kind of looking Tyranid in terms of the color contrast that you do get. The weapon, I hadn't quite decided what to do with that, so after giving it a little bit of a dry brush just to emphasize the edging on most of the body parts and also a bit on the plates, I decided to use a white speed paint to go over the sort of zenithal covered gun to just sort of make it more of a grey, because grey, blue, black and purple tend to be something of a colour scheme that works somewhat okay, and it just gives it a little bit of a pop relative to the rest of the body without being so garishly different. So it sort of blends in, but it stands out enough that there's differentiation. And this one sort of looked a little bit better than the first. As I said, a bit more traditional, a little bit more positive edge highlighting going in. So I did the dry brush, but it probably wasn't enough. So I did sort of do a little bit more detailing to try and emphasize some of the edges on both the feet and the legs, tail, that sort of thing, because contrast is king. When you're trying to make the thing sort of stand out, and clearly when it's black, that's kind of sort of disguises an awful lot of the shape of the model, and so to emphasize that a little bit, just adding a bit more seemed to bring it up to a better standard. And the next option was, let's do something totally different, and I had an idea of doing sort of a sandy feature, and so in this instance here I used Vallejo's skin colored sort of wash paint, so I thinned that down and sprayed it over just a plain grey model, no zenithal highlight. I thought I'll just paint on the highlights, and this time going over with Crusader skin and Pallid Bone speed paints. So the Crusader skin, the dark color for the body parts, to try and give it a bit of sort of a fleshy like look, to make it look a bit bleh, sort of ugly. Everyone hates sort of flesh looking animals, and tried that. Put the Pallid Bone on to the plating on the back, and the coloration really didn't have enough difference between the body therefore and the plates once it had dried, and thought, no, we've got to do something a little bit different. So experiment failure again, and this time I decided, okay, well, let's amp it up a little bit and use the speed paint Zealot Yellow. It's still got that sort of orange hue to it, but it's a little bit more vibrant. And again, whack that on. So speed paint does reactivate slightly, but because they're both a sort of a light color, you really didn't see any of that happening to be an issue, because this is speed paint 1, not speed paint 2. and just slather that on so you do get darkened body parts. And now we're chasing the contrast, so again another speed paint instead of all the inks that we used the first time round, and we're just using dark wood to go in and highlight the joints and the paneling in the body, and just to try and bring up a bit of contrast there to show a bit of differentiation. And it doesn't look too horrendous, but the model does look somewhat bland. It seems like it needs a little bit of a pop, in my opinion. So yeah, this one's still not so awesome. What I thought it was going to look like in my head really didn't turn out. So clearly we needed to do something to give it a little bit of vibrancy, and going with Leviathan purple contrast from Games Workshop on the weapon, that seemed to lift the model a little bit, because it's a totally different color, but yellows and purples tend to work relatively well together. So we slathered that on. I had tried using a vibrant electric type greeny blue on the sort of the casing, I guess, bits and pieces of the weapon there where the coils are or whatever they happen to be, but wasn't overly happy with that as a look. So I went in and just colored it white to just get rid of that green tone. And then after a little bit of some dry brushing just to emphasize some of the bits and pieces, used a little bit of crimson there detailing on the tongue, and then went in with a bit of purple just to sort of highlight the sort of those little panels on the gun. So not a great deal of contrast, but sort of a little bit plummy looking rather than the purple. And that's how we finished. So these were just a bit of experimentation, trying to be clever and have my own Hive Fleet rather than do what everyone else does. But it's also an opportunity to try using inks, try using contrast paints, mixing colors, trying to see what we get, and if anything's worthwhile pursuing. So the little black guy doesn't look horrendous because it's more your traditional sort of Tyranid appearance. And the last one, yeah, he's a bit kind of, if he was on a brown background you wouldn't even see him, I don't think. So perhaps not poppy enough. So you can see why Games Workshop does go punchy and all of their sort of models, I guess. But hey, it's a learning curve, and gave me something to do over a few weekends. So I will continue pondering on and hopefully come up with some better color schemes as we progress. But thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.